Hello, this is the Refrigeration Lab presentation by Group 1, consisting of Andrew Williams, Erin Mieth, James Fiorenza, and Dongjun. The purpose of this lab is to model a refrigeration system from Machine Chillers Incorporated and determine its capabilities, both in steady state and transient operation. For week 1, we must characterize the Vortex tube, characterize the motor and compressor, analyze the heat exchanger and accumulator, and analyze the steady state conditions of the refrigeration system shown in the figure to the right.
A characterization is done by varying input pressure from 0 psi to 80 psi by increasing 20 psi each. A figure on your left is a collected data at P3 location. Each segment of different pressure produce overshoot, and to increase precision and accuracy, a steady-state region is manually chosen. Here are the figures showing the chosen data points in steady states. This step is required to address the segment starting and ending index for the varying pressure. Those datasets have their standard deviation of 0.1071, 0.0897, 0.0619, and 0.1186 accordingly. Along the steady-state region segment in the different pressure, different types of measurements are shown in this table. The units for pressure, temperature, and the flow rate are psi, Fahrenheit, and liter per minute accordingly. The first column of this table is the nominal input pressure, which is supposed to share the same value with the pressure at location 3. The temperature at 0 psi should be equal to the ambient temperature, which is measured to be 69.48. The flow rate at 0 pressure also has to be 0. Those offsets needs to be subtracted. The table shows modified data and is converted to an SI unit. Here we can find that the T4H and mass flow rate are proportional to the input pressure. T4C, T load, and T5 are, on the other hand, are not proportional. A more specific relationship is shown in the next slide. These figures are the data plot from the previous table, showing the relationship of each T4 cold and hot, T load, and T5 along with the varying pressure. A York regression is applied to draw a fitting line, and the slope and y-intercept are shown in the graph. These figures are modeling of the steady-state relationship between P3 and T4C, M.C, T4H, and M.H. This is data collection of T3 and T ambient in their steady state. The average value for T3 is 295.4 K and T ambient is 293.977, which has less than 1% percentage difference.
Before characterizing the data, it is important to index out the parts that represent steady state, since we want to only characterize the steady state behavior of the motor and compressor. As seen on the left, the average temperature in green for the temperature at station 3 is a good representation since it's consistent and close to the ambient temperature of 293.98 Kelvin. The right represents the temperature at station 1, with each nominal PSI's average listed in pink. The T1 is not as consistent as the T3 because it was harder to collect data since the waiting time for steady state was longer. As seen in the plot, pressure at station 3 tends to be constant for each individual nominal PSI. Therefore, the average can be taken to represent steady state pressure. To characterize the steady state behavior of the motor and compressor, we collected values of temperature and pressure for 0, 16, 20, 31, and 40 psi. In this graph, we plotted the temperature at station 1 versus the pressure at station 3. Since energy is transferred into the air from the pumping engine, the job of the heat exchanger is to cool the air to ambient temperature. Therefore, we expected the T1 values to be larger than the ambient temperature as expressed by the positively sloped York fit in the plot. Contrastingly, the value of T3 is expected to be close to ambient temperature, if not exactly ambient temperature, because it is the temperature collected on the output side of the heat exchanger. This is expressed in the graph above because T3 is almost a constant value, which is expressed in the small gain we computed of 0.0163. To better visualize this, we can compare T1 and T3 side by side. Here we can see that T1 increases with increasing pressure, as represented in the blue dashed York fit line, while T3, which is represented as the pink dashed York fit line, remains almost flat and is close to the value of the ambient temperature in green. The motor and compressor draws in air at low pressure and discharges it at high temperature and high pressure. Therefore, it is expected that with increasing motor speed, that the pressure will increase linearly with it, as expressed in red in the plot shown for 0, 16, 20, 31, and 40 nominal psi.
The plot to the right shows that as we increase nominal pressure by increasing the motor speed, that the change in enthalpy becomes more negative, as shown by the linear regression, which has a gain of negative 0.9298 and an offset of 95,346.54 joules per second. As we increase the nominal pressure up to 40 psi, we end up with an enthalpy rate change of negative 32.344 joules per second, which means that more energy is being absorbed from the ambient air at 40 psi nominal pressure than at 20 and 0 psi nominal pressure, despite the fact that the block is insulated, just due to the fact that there's a face on the top that's not insulated and there's an air gap between the insulation and the block itself to allow for the heat transfer to occur. Ideally, we want T3 and T ambient to be equal and for P3 to be constant at steady state. However, experimentally, T3 and T ambient differed by about 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and P3 remained constant within about 1 psi at all nominal pressures. For this reason, we can say that the heat exchanger and the accumulator are working pretty well. They're pretty close, and that the heat exchanger and accumulator tank are necessary for this setup, as the difference between T load and T ambient increased the heat transfer rate from the ambient air to the block.
For this lab, ambient heating cannot be ignored. Henceforth, we are tasked to find the ambient heating for each of the nominal psi trials during the vortex tube experiments, all at steady state. The equation for ambient heating is shown below and is dependent upon the thermal resistance value, the ambient temperature, and the load temperature. As you can see, as the nominal psi increases, the ambient heating also increases. To find the ambient heating value, you must also know the thermal resistance value, or R insulation. We were tasked to find both the experimental and the theoretical values and compare them. As you can see in the equations below, the experimental value depends on a variety of temperatures as well as the cold mass flow rate, whereas the theoretical value depends on dimensions and the geometry of the insulation measured with calipers, and the thermal conductivity value. As you can see, the theoretical value differs from the experimental value by about a factor of 10. This could be explained through air gaps between the insulation and the block, or it could be explained through the fact that the insulation does not have a constant thermal conductivity value throughout.
Moving forward during week 2, we will have to perform a refrigerated load transient cooling analysis using both 80 psi building air and 40 psi compressor air, and comparing the two transient responses. Also, we'll have to perform a numerical uncertainty analysis to determine whether most of the uncertainty was due to sensor uncertainty, or due to modeling errors or simplifications due to assumptions we made during the experiment. The figure to the right shows the week 2 laboratory setup that we will be using.